Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 9:30. I would like to start the show. Probably people will walk in virtually during my introduction, but let's start to do not waste the valuable time of our appreciated speakers here. Good morning, everybody. My name is Niels van Oort. I'm the co-director of the Smart Public Transport Lab at Delft University of Technology, and it's my honor to organize this workshop here together with Maaike Snelder, both my colleague at TU Delft and also working at TNO, and also Maria Alonso Gonzalez, who was a former colleague at our lab and now working at the Knowledge Institute of the Ministry of Transport. And today we are going to talk about an exciting topic, or actually two exciting topics. First of all, about the future of public transport, which is my core business, you could say. But second of all, with a clear perspective from the era of emerging modes. And we already discussed that a couple of times in this conference about these emerging modes. But today we are going to specifically focus on what are the opportunities, challenges, risks maybe of these emerging modes with regard to this future of public transport. First of all, some housekeeping. Probably you have heard this before. Sorry for that, but just in case, because we would like to have you in an interactive modus and hope you know how that works in this platform. First of all, I would like you to invite you to write your name in the chat, your name and affiliation, so we have a little bit of idea who is in the audience, which actually is the thing to miss in an online conference, the networking part. But at least then we know who's there, and I would also like to invite you to connect afterwards with me or the other speakers if you have more questions or interested in research, etc. Make sure that you're in the session tab up there. And then you can have a look at the chat where you can put your name, affiliation, and also other chit chat questions, no, not questions, issues, I should say, because the questions you can put in the Q&A. And at least one of us is having an eye on these Q&A and also on this chat. And sometimes we'll answer them directly because while speaking, most of us cannot keep an eye on the chat. So probably we'll take the questions afterwards. But do actually, if you have any questions about the presentations, do put them in the Q&A session so we can directly after the presentation start with a lively discussion and Q&A. Some other things here, if you want to increase your screen, you can do it here by hiding some things, by maximizing your screen. Last thing to be mentioned is that this session is being recorded, so be aware of it. And we would like you again to invite you to have some interaction. We will present, but we actually are very interested in your input and also in the discussion during and at the end of this session. We're also going to use menti.com to ask you some questions. I will explain later. And last but not least, after this session, we will upload all the presentations for your convenience at this website, which will be mentioned later as well. Let me see some other things for housekeeping. And now let's go to the session itself, if that's all good for you. Here again are my co-organizers and co-speakers of this workshop. It's great to cooperate with them. It's Maaike Snelder, Maria Alonso Gonzalez, and myself here. And also feel free, if you're on Twitter, to share whatever you like to share with regard to this session, as long as you use the hashtags accordingly. So the schedule of today, after this introduction about trends and emerging modes, also some voting for you. So have your telephone or another device close, because I will ask you some questions via menti.com. After this introduction, I'll give the floor to Maria and Maaike and myself afterwards to discuss three specific emerging modes, as you can see here: pooled on-demand services, autonomous shuttles, and shared bicycles. We are sort of in the Netherlands, so we cannot avoid that last topic, of course. And afterwards, we would like to invite you for discussion about the future of public transport regarding these emerging modes. So about setting the scene for this workshop, I think it's not all news to all of you, but we see a couple of trends going on in society which are relevant, I think, for the topic of today. First of all, the societal trends. We have the millennials, the youngsters, who seem to have a different approach and attitude towards mobility. We think at this point they are more into sharing and less into processing. Let's hope that's indeed true. We also see a population aging, which has some impacts, you could say. And as a member of a university of technology, you should also like to stress this part. We see a lot of technology trends. We see electrification, information sharification, and automation, to mention all the buzzwords. And these technology developments actually support and lead to new kinds of modes on our streets, in our cities, in our countries, as shown here by a couple of examples: autonomous shuttles, autonomous metros, Hyperloop. Um, all new, and the question is there: what's in it for society? What's in it for the passengers? What's in it for us if we have these modes available? And how can we actually unlock the value of that? It's not only about these longer distances services. Also, I think there's much more attention these days to the first and last mile, which I think it's safe to say it's the weakest link in general of public transport. We see these e-scooters standing and sitting. We have a couple of shared bicycle systems. This is a picture from Delft with all colorful bikes before COVID, but also worldwide, we see them all trending, I would say. And of course, there's mobility as a service to connect, hopefully to connect them all, to integrate the ticketing information, etc. So there's a lot going on from that technology perspective. And last but not least, the elephant in the room, of course, is the pandemic. I'm very happy to see that it seems that we are opening up for our country, at least, waiting for my shot on Sunday. And it's obvious also that public transport was hit hard. I think all over the world, the ridership numbers dropped substantially. And now it's the moment to rethink, I would say, public transport, because we should open up. And that's also an opportunity maybe to change some things. And one of the things I would recommend to all operators, authorities, and etc., is to rethink public transport, including opportunities that emerging modes offer. And also emerging modes have their impacts of the pandemic, of course, both a positive, but maybe also a negative thing, because, for instance, the willingness to share, which is a topic Maria knows all about, might also be affected by this pandemic. So in the end, what we are looking for in our research lab and in general, I think, what is the optimal mix of all these modes we have available? And today we're going to discuss this optimal mix with regard to public transport, because maybe due to these emerging modes, we do not need public transport anymore. It used to be a popular opinion a couple of years ago. Given that I'm a co-director of a public transport lab, you might know my opinion here, but let's discuss this, because that's one side of the spectrum. And the other side might maybe be that these emerging modes actually offers new opportunities for public transport, and then 1 and 1 is 3. So let's see if we can get there. And of course, if I talk about the optimal mix of modes, the first scientific question at least would be, what's your objective? Because optimal is still not very crisp. And for this, in our lab, in our research, we tend to use this 5E model, showing that there's more than only mobility impacts like travel time and reliability. Of course, that's important, but it's much more. Also seen in the Urbanism Next framework, which I like very much. I'm happy to see at this conference, and more in society, we're also talking about the wider impacts of mobility, like space usage, like equity, like the climate, and also we would like to stress health, which is not per se due to the pandemic, but in general, I think getting a bigger problem worldwide, and obviously active modes could be of help here. So that's what we're going to discuss, hopefully with you. And we have 3 introductions about these modes, as mentioned: autonomous shuttles, on-demand transport, and shared bicycles later on. But before we go into that, I would like to ask you 2 questions via the Mentimeter, and then I will change screens here. Let me see. If you go to menti.com, and I will give you the code in a minute. I will share this one. Yes, I hope you can see it now. Menti.com, use the code, which is mentioned in top of your screen. I don't know if you see my pointer, but that is 65282431. And the question here to you, to all of you is, what do you think is the most promising emerging modes? And there's a list to pick from. And of course, the discussion is about what's promising. I leave that completely to you. And I would be interested to see what you think is the most promising one, and let's see what the opinion of the audience is here. There we go. First votes coming in. Thank you for joining. So far, see a preference or pulled on demand. Oh, there's a close call. Shared e-bicycles taking over. It's also interesting, but I'm not sure if we have sufficient time to see if this, if your ideas, if your opinion change actually after our introductions. Let's see. Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's still a close call, I would say there. I think it's the micro mobility ones, the shared e-scooter, whenever it's standing or sitting, is at the bottom, and it's shared e-bicycles. Oh, there's a change there. Shared e-bicycles is, I think, an obvious winner, if you would say, if you could use that word here. Okay, I'm happy to see, though, we didn't prepare this, of course, that at least the number 1, 2, 3 will be discussed in more detail later. So I'm happy to see that. Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to this, of course, in the discussion. And now I'll go back to my other screen again. Sorry for all these changes. There we go. I think we are now back in the PowerPoint. Because there's another question I would like to ask you, and it has to do with this hype cycle by Gartner. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's about the trajectory of new technology. How does it enter the market and where does it go? And of course, that's different for everything, but in general, they see this kind of process going on. There's a trigger in the beginning, then the specific technology is hyped to a level of inflated expectations, as you can see here on top, and then afterwards we get some more realism in the discussion maybe, and then there might be some disillusionment at some point, and we're going down quite quickly and quite deeply, you could say. But at some point, in general, of course, depending on the technology, we see the slope of enlightenment, and hopefully this promising technology reaches this plateau of productivity where it's actually into operations. And the second thing I would like to ask you via the Menti now is, where do you think these emerging modes we are talking about today, where do you think they are on this hype cycle? So try to remember this picture. We have the start, then we go up, then we go down, go up again to a final level. I'll go back to the Menti again. Can have a last look at the final results of our vote here. I think that's still the order is still the same. So let's go to the next ones. Here we can see them. So if you go to your device again, you can vote. You can use, don't look at the strongly disagree or strongly agree. It's about the numbers here, from 1 to 5. 1 was the left part of the picture, so the startup of this technology, and to the right, it's the end. The peak is at number 2. The valley, you could say, is at number 3, and the recoverage of this valley is number 4. I hope that's clear for you, and we can see where you think these modes actually are. Are we on the peak of autonomous shuttles? Are we in the full hype of it or not? And also with regard to the relative score of this. So far it seems that from your opinion, of course, we have a variation here as shown also. Shared bicycles are in the most mature stage compared to pooled on-demand services, which are Second, and autonomous shuttles are still somewhere on the hype or actually afterwards. And I think personally, I agree with this order of things. And also here, very happy to discuss this later on in the discussion, but also with regard to the presentations of one of us later on. Let's wait another minute to see if we change it a bit. Autonomous shuttles are still climbing up to the hype, from at least based on the average. But we all know, I think, what's the danger of only looking at averages. A quite wide range you could see for the pooled on-demand services. And of course, that's also depending on the context, even on the country, and also on the specific type. But Maria will explain us all about this. I think the variation for shared bicycle is, we agree most on this part, I would say. Okay, thank you very much. Very valuable for later as well. And then the last switch of today, at least for this presentation, I should say. Going to the end of my introduction. Here we are, there's the hype cycle again. And that's actually a thing I would like to explain to you. What do you think? Yes, there, this arrow, because that's actually what we researchers try to do, I think, implicitly, probably. In the end, it's okay to have a hype for multiple reasons. Also, this valley could be of value, but I think we could save a lot of money and time if we could somehow shortcut these stages by bringing in knowledge, experiences, and I think science plays an important role there actually for this shortcut. And I'm not that naive that we will never have hypes again because of providing scientific research, but I think this could really help to get realism, and not a positive bias, not positively biased, not negatively biased, but trying to look for the real impacts, positive or negative, whatever. Whatever are we going to expect from this 5E wide perspective, I would say. And there's a lot of work in progress all over the world, I think, if we talk about emerging modes. There's theoretical research, there are pilots going on, so happy to see also during this conference that we share this knowledge, because that's, of course, of major importance. And that's also what we try to do now. So here we are. If you want to get in touch with us afterwards, make a picture of the contact details or find us via your favorite social media channel. For now, I would stop it here. I would like to wish you a good workshop. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. And then I would like to ask Maria to share her screen and to take the floor.
Okay, so thank you, Niels. And my name is Gonzalez, and I'm working at the KIM, the Netherlands Institute for Transport Policy Analysis, which is a part of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management here in the Netherlands. And as Niels said before, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about these pooled on-demand services. And the first thing that I wanted to go back to how traditional public transport it looks like today, and what are their advantages and disadvantages. So some of you may be familiar with this picture. It's quite old, 30 years old, but still it very well visualizes the reality of why we need collective transport. And on the picture on the left, where we can see all those cars, we can as well imagine that they're electric vehicles, that they're automated vehicles. The bottom line is we need some kind of collectiveness in our transportation, and that we also need in the transport of the future, regardless of whether we include in this innovation. We have to make sure that there's some density in the transport that we supply. But traditional public transport, as we have it today, is inflexible with fixed schedules and routes, and those fixed schedules and routes may be very useful when they're very recurrent and when the routes are very well used, but it may not be the case when those routes are not the right ones, or when the densities in those routes are quite low. In those occasions, public transport, as it is now, it may not be the right size. So my question is, what about if we introduce a service which still is collective, but which has flexible times and routes, and which tailors its size a little bit more to the demand needs of the area, of the route that we have. And this is what pooled on-demand services help to achieve. And for those of you who are still thinking, okay, what exactly are we talking about? Here I have some pictures of some services of this kind, both in the Netherlands and worldwide. These services have been given multiple of names. I like to refer to them as pooled on-demand services because of their pooled nature, their on-demand nature. But we could see two different types within them. Those which are a bit more, which look a little bit more like public transport, and that's also referred to as microtransit, especially in the US. And those which are a little bit more like ride-hailing, ride-sourcing services, just where you pool your ride with one or two other passengers, such as Uber Pool. But here we want to look at those together because they both look at this on-demand nature and pooling rides together, which is something that we need in urban and suburban areas. So for this presentation, I want to look into three aspects in particular of these pooled on-demand services. The first thing is, are we willing to share rides? Because if we're not willing to share rides, then there's no point in keeping talking about these pooled services. The second one is whether these services act more like complements or substitutes of public transport. And the third point that I want to discuss with you in this presentation is how to integrate these pooled on-demand services to traditional public transport. And in the presentation, I will have examples primarily from the Netherlands, which is our virtual host in this conference, and from the US, which is the sister conference and the original Urbanism Next conference organizer. So let's move to the first question. Are we willing to share rights? And before I keep talking, I would like you to think of this question with me. So if we are offering a service, let's think about Uber. It doesn't need to be Uber, but we know that Uber sometimes, at least before the pandemic, it used to offer in some cities individual services and pooled services where you could share your rides with other unknown passengers. So these on-demand users of these users using these kind of services requested. Let's think of prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, pooled rides over the individual ones. So if you can type in the chat your opinion about how many, in percentage, how many of those users using these on-demand services requested pooled rides when they could choose between pooled rides and individual rides. Any thoughts on that? Any numbers? We see 17%, 20%. Any other numbers? Okay, so I have to say that these numbers, 10%, these numbers are really accurate. So there's some, oops, sorry, I don't know what happened. I just stopped sharing. Now again. These numbers are really accurate. I think I know what. Okay, yeah, now. Now, it's around 20%. So around 20% of the users who could use between individual and pooled rides would go for pooled rides. And if we also think about the total amount of rides, previous findings show that it's also around 20%. These numbers are primarily from the US and China, but it gives an idea that most of the people don't seem to want to share the rides. So in the Netherlands, we were interested in knowing, is it that also our case? And we didn't really have Uber Pool, and on-demand services, they do not work at the scale at which they work in the US. So we did a stated preference survey. We asked a representative sample of the urban and suburban Dutch population from the MPN panel, which is a panel from the Kim Institute. We asked them a series of scenarios where they had to choose between an individual ride or a pooled ride. And the differences were differences in cost and differences in time. And for the pooled alternative, there were also different numbers of passengers with which you would be sharing the ride. And that could be 1 extra passenger, 2 extra passengers, or 4 extra passengers. And what we found is that less than 1/3 of these individuals had strong preferences against sharing their on-demand rides. We found 4 different clusters if we wanted to categorize those respondents. And it is just one of those clusters, which we named as It's My Ride, the ones that were not very inclined to sharing. But for the other clusters, it was about the time-cost trade-offs. So maybe right now, what we're doing is not giving the right time-cost trade-offs in our individual versus our pooled alternatives. So this about sharing rides. And now the second question, are pooled on-demand services being used as complements or as substitutes of public transport? And I would say this is a very general question, and it really depends on the context. And additional studies are really necessary to be able to say, okay, in which context it is more of a complement or a substitute. But I want to talk to you about one case in the Netherlands, which was Bremflex, which was implemented in the city of Nijmegen, in the east of the country. And there, what we showed was that there were large increases in accessibility, which suggested more of a complementary relationship than a substitutive relationship. And here you see some of the results of quantitative results of the study. And I don't want you to look too much at these specifics, but one thing I want to highlight, and it's that for half of the rides, the perceived time of the duration of the ride would have been twice or more than twice if they had taken the public transport alternative over this pooled on-demand alternative, which really shows that there's quite a difference in how passengers perceive their trip. And when we looked at the complementing aspect of it, approximately 20% of the rides started or ended at a train station, which could mean that these may have been first or last mile trips for a train trip. But again, this is very much context related. And one important thing also from this study was that it really depends on how you integrate these services. And this is my third question, how to integrate pooled on-demand services with public transport. And here, if we look into the US, the focus is on partnerships between public transport and TNCs. This figure of the US is not the newest. It's from 2018, from research from Zwitterman and colleagues. But it already shows that back then, many cities, many areas in the US were already having some partnerships between the public transport providers and TNCs. And which were the reasons for these partnerships? Where here I include 5 of the reasons that were highlighted in this research, but I want to highlight 3 of them. So filling the gaps of public transport, mitigating parking shortages, and promoting mobility for seniors. And those three things are also problems in Europe, right? So how is Europe trying to look at that? And in Europe, the approach is a little bit different, and it goes more into mobility by Niels. And in the Netherlands, in particular, there are 7 pilots that are being implemented to try to better understand how public transport can be complemented by all kinds of modes of transport. The main difference between the US approach and the European approach is that in Europe it's not only about pooled on-demand services and public transport, but it's more about all the mix. Also what Niels was mentioning, it's about all the alternatives that we have and put them together. If you want to know more about the 7 DATS pilots, I would recommend that you get in touch with Erik Ming or with Liselotte Bingen, both of which are in this conference. If you want to listen to something more about MaaS, and in particular of a study in which also pooled on-demand services were included in the mix, then I recommend that you have a look at the Research in Transit podcast, which is a really nice podcast on public transport from Monash University in Australia. And on the 3rd episode, Laura Aston discussed with me some of the results in this MaaS study. So what I want to say in the end is that maybe the US and Europe have somewhat different approaches, but it's the same reality. Integration does not come without its challenges. Public transport providers need to take that into account. Municipalities need to take that into account when, for example, deciding on making somehow different concessions in the future. The second one is that data can be an important instrument to understand the impact of pooled on-demand services and other modes on public transport. In the US, we see the mobility data specification and how Los Angeles is working very hard on that topic. In the Netherlands, the Dutch government is going to analyze some of the data of the MaaS pilots to better understand what exactly they mean for public transport, for mobility. The third one is that pooled on-demand services should be evaluated, integrated with other existing alternatives and not as an isolated mode, which was the way that modes were evaluated in the past. And last, that an integrated service approach with public transport can also help increase more equity in urban accessibility and decrease any collateral risks from public transport revenue as a result of people shifting to these new modes of transport. So finally, I want to share with you 3 key takeaways. First, one size does not fit all. Same as in a toolbox, it's also the same for mobility, and it's also the same in relation to public transport. So pooled on-demand services can help increase this amount of sizes in the options, in the solutions that we can have at our disposal. The second one is when we analyze individual versus pooled services from the user perspective, those trade-offs, they are more important than whether people share or not share their rights. And third one is that, is it a complement or a substitute of public transport? It is not black or white. And we need to integrate both services to really get those synergies working between both. I have here some references if you want to go a little bit deeper into what was mentioned in the presentation. And with that, I would like to thank you and see if there are some questions from you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for sharing all this information. And I know there's much more for the people who would like to dive further. There was a question about the podcast. You can later on during the session, please put a link in the chat so everybody can find it.
I will.
And maybe you can also put a link to your amazing thesis you wrote last year if people are interested to learn more. There's a question from Willem van Heiningen. I think it's from the municipality of Amsterdam, if I saw that correctly. And he asks the following for you. What are the reasons for people to use or not use pooled on-demand services? Do you know? What are the major triggers, satisfiers, dissatisfiers?
Well, I would say, first of all, the individuals need to find the added value in real this service. And with past services, often they have not worked successfully, but this may be because not many people were aware of the service. So increasing awareness is a big issue. So when thinking about the Dutch case, for example, we are not quite there yet with these modes of transport, but if we think of car sharing, bike sharing, which seem like they are more in our society and they're more well known, still they face the awareness problem. Many people are still not aware. Even for us, it's that for granted because we are very much in this working environment. Many people still do not know them, do not know how to use them. And the other thing about pulled on-demand services is that reliability was till now a bit of an issue, at least in some of the pilots. So you really want to have a good service, and maybe having to request your ride with half an hour in advance is too large of a window gap. Not knowing when exactly it will arrive, it's too much. So those things, they need to still be improved, and the user interface needs to be perfect, same as any other system that we are used to right now. We want to have perfect user interface. We want to have a here and now, and that also needs to be implemented into pulled on-demand services for people to be willing to use them.
Okay, thanks, Maria. I hope that's satisfying for Willem as well. Also would like to acknowledge Jérôme Villepelay, sorry for your last name probably, but he is actually the winner of the prize of your first question, because I think he had a spot-on answer to that one. It's up to you which prize, Maria.
Okay.
Last question from me before we continue to Maaike, our next speaker. Maybe a brief answer, although it's a hard one. Talking about this topic, of course, there's multiple difference between the context. Oh yeah, your research mainly focused on the urban setting. The challenges are also there in a rural area, and then also the solution might help. But what do you think is the should be the priority if we look from a country perspective? Where to focus on: urban, suburban, rural, something else? What would be your, if you need to prioritize things?
That's indeed a difficult one, because both all rural, urban, suburban, there can be improvements made everywhere. But I think the difference is that in rural, people are okay with longer waits, but also in rural, people are very much dependent on cars, which means that there's not so many people who would be willing to take up the service, whereas in urban areas, we have so many congestion problems, we have so many space problems, and we have the densities to make it actually work. So I would say both areas could be benefiting from it, but in a different way.
Okay, thanks again, Maria. And if there are more questions to be discussed, Maria will be here, and also later she will join our discussion. Then I would like to announce the following speaker, which is Maaike Snelder from TU Delft and TNO. So we expect a lot from that two-job perspective, Maaike.
Thanks, Niels. I like high expectations. Good morning, everybody. My presentation will be about the impact of vehicle automation on public transport, and I'll zoom in a little bit on shuttles, but I also take the wider perspective of a complete mobility system. Okay, so let's get started. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will first explain something about vehicle automation for cars and public transport, because automation of cars also affects public transport users. Then I'll explain the impact on the users of public transport. Then we move to mobility system design, so which kind of interventions can be taken. And then I'll explain something about how you can move from pilots to real implementation, and end with some conclusions and main takeaways. Okay, so first about vehicle automation of cars and public transport. Well, actually this is not something new. I think about 100 years ago it already started with automation of, well, I couldn't really call it cars, but let's say private transport, where some kind of radio automation was used. And to see that decades later, that's still going on, and starting with automating some functions of driving up to well, higher levels of automations later on. For public transport, it started a bit later. So you see in the 80s that the first automated metro was there. In the Netherlands, in the 90s, shuttle was introduced. So that was the first form of automated public transport in the Netherlands. And of course, also here, developments continued, and we're now looking at automated buses as well. So I think most of you will be familiar with the levels of automation, but might be good to repeat that there are different levels of automation ranging from no automation at all to full automation where the driver is not needed anymore and the vehicle can drive everywhere, so complete operational domain. I think a big step is when you move from level 2 to level 3, where the vehicle takes over more and more responsibilities. So please keep these levels in mind because they will return later. Then when we talk about shuttles, so I mentioned before that for public transport, well, also the different modes of public transport are being automated, but we will zoom into the shuttles. They have a low operating speed, between 15 and 25 kilometers per hour, a small passenger capacity, usually between 6 and 12 passengers, and the level of automation is level 4 or 4 plus. So there's driverless operation, no user interface, no driver engagement, and but a limited operational design domain. Okay, so much about what's going on with respect to automation. Now the question is, what is the impact of automation on public transport users? And in order to answer that question, we have looked at the scenario designed by the Kim. And they have different axes. So there is one vertical axis ranging from low levels of sharing or low willingness to share to high willingness to share. And on the horizontal axis, you see level 3 and 4 automation and level 5 automation on the right. So I skipped the lower levels of automations in this example. And the question is, what will be the impact of these scenarios on public transport users? So we have developed a model, the new mobility modeler, to assess these impacts. And we did this for a case study in the province of North Holland in the Netherlands. And well, you can see the impacts on model split at the bottom left. So when there is no extra automation, then you see a reference scenario on the left, where there are still a lot of car users, but also relatively high shares of walking and cycling, and public transport is indicated in blue. So the dark, not the darkest color, but middle dark blue are trains, and light blue are buses, trams, and metros. And then you see when there's level 5 sharing or level 5 no sharing and level 3, 4 no sharing and sharing. You see actually in all scenarios that there's a model shift from walking, cycling and public transport to automated private cars and taxis or shared taxis. Yeah, that's probably not desirable. But what you also see is that the user acceptance has a large impact on the results. It's not indicated in this figure, but of course acceptance of automations is very important. So there's also a lot of uncertainty here. In any case, if we want to maintain high accessibility and livability of cities, it will be important to apply a strong mix of interventions to keep these shares of walking, cycling and public transport high. And that is what I will explain in the coming slides as well. So what kind of interventions are we talking about? Making the car less attractive doesn't sound really popular, but it's often the attention. So road pricing is an option here. Parking rates, increasing parking rates is an option. Decreasing the parking capacity, so car-free cities is an option. And higher car ownership taxes is an option. And of course, there are many more options. And when you see these interventions, you'll immediately understand that the goal is not to make cars less attractive, but to keep cities accessible and livable. And the other option is, of course, to make public transport more attractive. So you can look at higher frequencies, introduce shared cars or bikes, look at hubs, because they will be needed to facilitate all kinds of other modes and to reduce the car uses. And you can look at shuttles. So we have actually looked at some of these interventions with the same model. And well, you see the results on this slide. It's a bit much information, but I'll talk you through. So on the top left, you see the original results, so without additional interventions. And then we applied some of the interventions to the level 5 no sharing scenario and some interventions to the level 5 sharing. So in the middle, there is the level 5 no sharing scenario. And there we introduce parking at a distance. So you cannot park in a city center anymore, but you have to park further away and use a hub. And there are also some road pricing scenarios and improved public transport. And when you look at the green and blue parts of it, so that's the walking, cycling and public transport, then you see that actually a high level of road pricing is needed to maintain the original levels that you have in the reference scenario. And on the right, you see the scenario with sharing. And there we applied a higher, well, we took interventions to make sharing more popular. We even assumed that 100% of the people was willing to share, so that's extreme, but just to indicate what happens. A reduced time factor for on-demand public transport, so more vehicles, less waiting time. We removed the automated private taxis, and we applied a whole mix of interventions. And also here you see that a real strong mix of interventions is actually needed to get a higher public transport share and maintain the levels of walking and cycling. Because otherwise, if you have these automated vehicles or automated cars, they are just too attractive and they compete with these modes. Well, at the bottom you see the impacts on congestion and also number of vehicles needed and so on, but for now I will skip that. I think just to say that, of course, when the share of cars is lower, also the levels of congestion will be lower and the cities will be more attractive. Then we also used a more detailed model to look at combined scenarios. So there we reduced the parking capacity, in this case in the city centers of Rotterdam, The Hague and Delft in the Netherlands. And we introduced hubs at different locations, so close to the center and further away from the center. And we offered shared bikes and shared e-bikes at those locations. And then you see at the bottom what happens with the model split. So in this example, you see that the car users reduces, and especially the users of bikes and e-bikes increases, and there's a small increase in traditional public transport. And this is a bit of a more detailed picture where you see Rotterdam and The Hague. Well, for those of you not familiar with the Netherlands and this area, The Hague is in the yellow part and Rotterdam is in the orange part, and Delft is in between. And well, the locations where you see the different bars, that's where we place the hubs. And well, just to say here that On average, combined over all these hubs, the bike is for the e-gross motor bike is used in 11% of the cases, e-bike 8%, and traditional public transport 82%. Of course, these hub locations were chosen in such a way that they were connected to traditional public transport. So that's also quite illustrative for the Netherlands, is that we have a lot of public transport. So yeah, it's still relevant to use, of course. Okay, so this is a bit of a picture or view for the faraway future. And now the question is, how do we get there? And it's already, I think, quite a long time that we have been experimenting with a lot of pilots. And the question is, which ones are successful? How can we scale up? And how can we have solutions that are there to stay, actually? Of course, a lot of pilots are going on, but now I'll zoom into shuttles. So what you see here in this picture is research that was done for Europe and the number of pilots that were going on. And you see in this case that it started in 2004, and the number of pilots increased rapidly from 2014 onwards. You see here in 2019 there were 55 pilots found in Europe. And at the bottom you see the spread over the different countries. So in France there were quite a lot of pilots, but also in some other countries there were a lot of pilots as well. And in the Netherlands you see 8 that were considered. There are actually more, but this is the number considered in this study. However, when you look at the duration of those pilots, and the question is which of them were successful and were out there for more than a year or more than 2 years or even longer than that, it's only a very small subsample. So here you see on the horizontal axis the number of months of the pilot. So on the left is 1 month, and then you see on the right 34 months, so almost more than 3 years. And then you see the number of pilots indicated. So by far, most of the pilots took less than 4 months, and only a small subset were successful enough to stay longer. So the question is, what can we do about this, and how can we increase success rates? So there was a check with experts, and we asked their views on this to find interesting development directions. We looked at main drivers and barriers, and you see them over here. It might be a bit difficult to read on the smaller screen, but to summarize the main conclusions here is that the biggest drivers are limited fares of these shuttles and the fact that they are automated. And the biggest barrier is a low operational speed. So I think that one is quite important as well, as because well, in the end you still compete with other access and egress modes, and you have to find the right locations where to apply these shuttles in such a way that even though the speed is low, it's still attractive. Of course, there are more things important here. So also mentioned in the previous presentation is, where do you apply them, for instance? Is it in urban regions or rural regions? What kind of infrastructure do you use? Is it on dedicated lanes or in mixed infrastructure? What is the way of operating? So schedule-based or on demand? And also the way of supervision is included here. So remote controlled or onboard stewards. So there are all kinds of different scenarios, and I think it's very interesting to explore which ones are most successful. Of course, shuttles are not the only pilots that are going on. Cities experiment with a lot of new mobility concepts and emerging modes. So what I wanted to mention, and that's almost the last slide, is the Sumalab project, where many different cities and the large cities in the Netherlands are included, and also different regions participate. And the focus of that project is to look at how we can scale up these pilots to full-fledged implementations with a focus on accessibility, sustainability, safety, and livability. And there, the focus is on different options for last mile transport, so not only shuttles, but also e-bikes, for instance, bikes, shared bikes, and so on. Door-to-door transport, and also interventions that cities can take themselves, like capacity for shared bikes, charging locations for electrification, reduced parking capacity for cars, and so on. And in order to help them to scaling up, we focus on business models, technical feasibility, impact assessment, so what are the expected mobility and livability impacts, scalability, and we also try to develop a design method that focuses on an area and then finds the best solution for different locations in cities, different kinds of trips, and so on. Okay, so that brings me to the main takeaways. I think a clear multimodal vision is needed, including these emerging modes. Important to steer towards these society goals and not just let it happen. And really focus on how we can make these pilots as successful as possible, so that they really become solutions that are used on a larger scale. And there it's important to focus on the business case, the technical feasibility, and also on the expected impact and the fit in the mobility system. In this presentation, I combined different research actually, so there's more information that you can find in all these sources explained on this sheet. So with that, I would like to conclude and take time to move to the questions.
Thank you, Maaike. So there's one question from Klaus, where he says, thanks, Maaike. Are the current pilots of automated vehicle shuttles really meaningful, given the still limited capability of technology? Full-scale levels 5 is still not on the roads.
Yeah, the question might be here, what is meaningful? I think you also see a shift in objectives, where first technical feasibility was tested, and now the focus is shifting more towards how you can actually make these shuttles attractive and really let them have a place in the mobility system so that you get a high number of users. And of course, these systems become more attractive when they are at level 5 and when they are in mixed traffic and more flexible and so on. So yes, meaningful in testing different things, and important to really shift to this function in the whole mobility system.
Thank you, Maaike. And I think now we're going to move to the last talk with Niels again about shared.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maaike, for your inspiring presentation. Here we go. Slides are visible, I assume. Maria will help me timing, because I would like to have also sufficient time for discussion in the end. There's so much to discuss and to share. But I would also like to ask attention for this low-tech mode. We heard a lot about more high-tech stuff, which is great. But I would like to discuss with you to a lower tech mode, namely the bicycle, as you could expect from the Dutch But I will assure you that I think this is not per se only a Dutch-only solution, but let's see for yourself. Already talked about access equals first and last mile. I see a shift these days in attention, not only on the core stop-to-stop trip of public transport, which is important, of course, but also on this first and last mile. And as mentioned before, there are plenty of new modes actually arriving and leaving again sometimes to the markets, to our cities, which could potentially benefit actually to improve these first and last mile. We've already seen a couple of them. You also see some pictures here. I'm not sure about your own cities, but I live in a not very hot and happening suburb near The Hague, and even there I see these e-scooters now in our neighborhood. So I would say that they really penetrate our society. The standing scooters are not allowed yet in the Netherlands, but I think there will be a moment soon when we also see them here. However, I would like to discuss about cycling. This is one of my favorite pictures actually from the pre-COVID days, cycling in Delft with the ministry and the European Commissioner. We had a tour, and I like to use this quote from our Dutch transport minister: "We need more bicycles, public transport, and brains." And that's actually also one of the slogans of our research labs dealing with public transport and with active modes in our group. We hopefully can contribute to that statement and to that mission. So we're going to talk about cycling and public transport. There are multiple ways to deal with it. What I found discussing with internationals is that in general, they start to talk about taking your cycle with you on board. But actually, that's not what I'm going to talk about. It's great though, but I'm going to talk about cycling to the station, park it, and maybe at the other end also have a bike available, your own or a shared one, of course. And I think if you have visited the Netherlands and you've seen our parking lots near the stations, I think you know why I'm not focusing on everybody bringing his bike on board. And this is important, I think, to stress the benefits of cycling in general, but also this combined mode. I tend to say it's a good news show. It's good for health, safety, congestion. You can see it here. Also related to this 5E model I explained in the introduction. I think if you design it well, both the cycling infrastructure and services and also public transport, I think you really could tick all boxes here. And also a thing I would like to stress is that by having sufficient and high quality bicycle services, bicycle infrastructure, etc., you can actually also improve public transport, because that's one of the main things to be discussed here. Is the bicycle friend or enemy of public transport? In our country, I think it used to, especially the public transport operators used to look at the bicycle as a competitor, which is actually true. Especially in urban areas, but I think from a societal perspective, it's obvious that that's a good thing. So from a societal perspective, I think that's a good way to go. And in addition, again, I think the bicycle could also help actually public transport to improve, and it has to do with this picture research in our lab showing the willingness to cycle, actually the willingness to cover distances, catchment areas of stops, you could say. How far do we want to cycle towards the stop? And that depends on a lot of factors, of course. We did a literature review before and we found up to 40 factors. But the one I would like to stress here is the quality of service of the public transport level. The higher the public transport level, think about travel times, think about reducing transfers, intercity services and that kind of things, the higher the catchment area of that stop will be. And then we come to this classical public transport design dilemma. Are we going for a dense network or are we going for a frequent network? If you want to learn more about this, I would like to recommend this link. If there's a video on YouTube, actually by the colleagues of Maria from the Knowledge Institute. It's a great animation. And this is the ultimate dilemma in general in designing public transport networks. And by actually providing proper first last mile solutions by bicycles, but also the other modes, you can actually shift from dense to frequent, not per se always, but in general. And we know from all over the world, if you go from dense to frequent, in general, you will see the numbers as shown here. Ridership will increase and cost will will be reduced. And that's in the end, of course, not always the case in public transport, if I state it mildly. So I think there's a big potential for both the users of the system, smooth door-to-door systems going from origin to destination, but also for the public transport industry itself to improve their systems. So let's talk about shared bikes, because that's what we miss in this whole formula at the end of the trip. Although a lot of Dutch people have a second bike at their destination station, you could say, but in general, that's the weakest part if you look at first last mile. And I think there's a lot of opportunities. What you see here on this timeline, we talk a lot about the shared bicycles since a couple of years, but it's not new at all. It's actually started even before I was born in the 60s in Amsterdam. It was only an experiment of a couple of days, I've heard, because then all bikes were stolen or damaged or ended up in the canals. It took some time, but in the 90s, in some other countries, it was introduced again. And nowadays, since a couple of years, I think we have these smart locks, which can be opened by your smartphone. Very simple. Even I can handle that technology, and I think that's a big breakthrough for the shared bicycle systems. Also would like to mention with regard to the Dutch case is this OV fiets, which you can see there, starting from 2003, which is for me a big success. Maybe the best innovation in Dutch public transport is this bicycle which you can rent at almost all Dutch train station. Talking about shared bicycles, we have multiple types all over the world. We see them. We have the station-based ones, like this OV fiets. You can only take them at the train station, and they are extending towards more locations, I should say. But in general, it's fixed to the train station, and you also need to return it. And that's the other dimension on this graph. Besides dockless or stationless and station-based, we also have return or single trips. You can see all the brands here, and there are multiple more. So there's already a large collection, you could say, of shared bicycles. What I found interesting is about these shared bicycles is why are we using them, and who is going to use them, and how could we actually contribute to these five E objectives, if that's the goal of your city or society, because that's up to you, not up to me. But for us as researchers, we'd like to know how it works. We did a survey amongst users of multiple systems in Delft. You can see the results here, and also the paper is available, of course, for more details. And actually, we looked at two shared bicycle systems, so the OV fiets, so the PT bike, but also Mobike, the Chinese dockless one. We also looked at the swap fiets, which you might be aware of. It's the one with the blue tires. That's actually more of a lease bike, you could say. But it's an interesting part of the Delft variation of bicycles. And here you can see why people actually prefer these bicycles. You can see the difference between them. For instance, OV fiets is technically seen a much better bike than a Mobike, and that's also what you see user-wise, because it's also more expensive. You see more older people using those bikes than the Mobikes. Also, you see already a first idea who are the users, and what would they do if there wouldn't be a bike, because that's also one of the main questions, I think. What would happen without these bikes? Because if we're looking for more sustainable mobility, for instance, shared bicycles are not per se more sustainable. That's quite depending, actually, about if we really make a model shift, if we really enable a model shift from less sustainable modes, such as car traffic. Because if everybody who used to work now jumps on a bike, I would actually like to defend that it's actually not sustainable. So that's also important to be aware of. You can read some more things. Also good to state here, also with regard to mobility as a service, is the lower one. This OV fiets is very comfortable from a user perspective, because you can actually pay it with the same card, the smart card, as you can use public transport with. So this integration of ticketing in this case is very much appreciated. Very important, besides the passenger perspective, the user perspective, for a successful bike sharing system, is the supply side of it, the rebalancing of your bikes. We all know the example, I think, of the bikes ending up downhill in Paris, for instance, and somebody has to bring them up again. But also you see some numbers here. If you look at the last column here, how many trips are made per bike? That's of course of essential. That's an essential KPI for your business case. It's nice if a company wants to provide bicycles, but if there's no business case for them and there's no subsidy involved, I think it's safe to say that at some point they will leave again. And this kind of KPIs are important. And you see the major differences here between, for instance, Barcelona and Perpignan and at the lower part of the city. This is also what we discussed with Mobike in Delft. It was one of their main challenges. How can we actually manage that these bikes are used multiple times, that the bikes are at the right moment at the right time? That's one of the challenges from that perspective. As I said, I think model shift is key. This is research by Fishman. Very nice research, I should say. I would recommend to read his work in general, but specifically this one. We see actually what's the model shift by what did the users of shared bicycles used before shift using a bicycle, and you can see it from multiple places in our world, and you see that it's actually competing with public transport. It's safe to say. Also, it's sort of cannibalizing walking and normal bicycling. And the main question for cities and authorities, I would say, is how much of this, I would say, collateral damage, especially if you talk about active modes here, would you accept to achieve this model shift from car? Because I don't think it's not realistic to think that only people from car will shift. You will always have, I think, this collateral damage if you talk about walking and cycling, maybe. And public transport is debatable there, because if you look at the numbers, the model shift numbers from Mobike in Delft, what we saw here, after the introduction of Mobike, we also saw that the conventional active modes decreased. Also, local bus services reduced, but the train services actually saw an increase. And I think that has all to do with the design dilemma I mentioned in the beginning. Because the bicycle here is competing with these dense public transport networks which are accessible, but on the other hand also very slow. And then the bicycle is a great competitor, especially if the weather allows. Regarding the train, it's obvious that people are not going to cycle 50 or 100 kilometers. So in that case, we saw this increase. And also nice to mention here, University of Amsterdam research shows recently that in the Netherlands, the users of this combined mode of cycling and trains, actually about 66% of them do own a car. So they actually choose for this combination over the car because it's much more convenient. Last thing to show here on this regard is HTM. That's the public transport operator in The Hague. They also introduced themselves their own bicycle system, shared bicycle system. And what you see here from the left, the previous mode, to the right, the new mode, you also see here some cannibalizing public transport. And what's the message here is, I would say, yes, that's true. But if you look more on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, if you look at travel portfolios of people, we see that they actually have maybe one day they use public transport, the other day they use this shared bicycle. So in the end, I think that also helps to make a move in general from car to more sustainable mobility. And that's, I think, a thing to look at. To finalize the takeaways, you can read them here. I think shared bicycles, in addition to the other emerging modes and traditional modes, have their role to stimulate green and also healthy mobility, as mentioned a couple of times. They can complement public transport in general, I think, both in a multimodal trip, but also in this travel portfolio I mentioned. I think that's a very important thing to be aware of. Public transport networks could actually be improved. And it would even better if we start designing public transport to already take this mode into account. And from a research perspective, I think this is also a very promising and interesting research domain. If you're interested in our research agenda, our results so far, but there's a lot of work in progress here, have a look at this website and find this infographic with more information. Also here we have podcasts are popular these days, so there's also a podcast about this combined mode, and there's lots to read if you like. But for now, I would like to say I would say hi from all the lab members involved in all the work showed here, and happy to discuss with you about this presentation, but also about the previous ones. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Niels. I see that there's one question in the chat as well, but I'm actually not sure if it was still about my presentation or about your presentation. So, Peter van Buiten, maybe you can put it in the chat, and then in the meantime, we can have a look at the Q&A. So there's a question from Klaus. It says, hi Niels, to what extent can shared bikes help to deal with peak demand in public transport?
Yeah, that would be great. Let's first start if that is going to help, and I think it could. Although also here I think it's also about collateral damage. I'm not sure if damage is the right word, but I don't think you can only catch the peak demand, the peak demand, I would say. But I think you can focus on it and try to shave the peak actually, yeah, because that's the holy grail in public transport. And I think also COVID will help us a lot, hopefully, given our travel patterns, etc. But I think this could also help to provide a more convenient alternative in peak hours, which could help. And then in the end, I think also public transport benefits, because this extreme peak, sometimes it's only 20 minutes, 15 minutes of a day where we need all vehicles for. That's of course, that's obvious, not very efficient. So I think this would be a great direction to go into.
Yes, thank you. And then another question from Willem van Heiningen. That's about the business case. Is included in land use or investment in real estate to stall bikes. So I think the cost, what is the business case if you also consider the cost of stalling bikes?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's actually done these days, but actually I would recommend to do it, especially if you talk about the large stations in the Netherlands. For those who have been there, that's popular ground, so to speak. That's expensive square meters there, and also bikes come with a need there. So that's a tricky thing. And in that case, if you want to, and there's the real estate people, they have clear business cases about offices or whatever. And then the other thing is, okay, yeah, parking bikes doesn't yield anything. And I think then you should go into the more societal business case. And for instance, looking at the 5 E's or whatever framework you're using, what are the benefits of having these bikes there at these hotspots? That's obvious. And I'm also happy and proud to say that if you look at the Netherlands and Utrecht and The Hague, there are actually quite new recent parking stations, which are also in Delft, by the way. And the sad news is in general that after they have built and started to operating, we also need another one, because there's a lot of latent demand as well. But for the business case, I think if we only look at financial business cases, it's not going to fly. But if you look at the more societal perspective, then I think you can have a more honest assessment, if that's the answer to the question.
Yes. Thank you, Niels. I don't see a reaction from Peter. Maybe you can unmute yourself if possible. I don't know.
Not possible.
Not possible. Well, then in that case, I think, Niels, that you should move on.
Yes.
With the next
indeed. We have a last Menti actually to get your opinion, and feel free to keep on putting questions or comments in the chat or Q&A or wherever you can put them. I will try to have a look at it together with Maria and Maaike. But first, I would like you to answer the following, no, not questions, to agree or disagree with some of our final propositions. Let me see. As I said, we like to talk about our work, but we are even more interested in your opinion. Let me see. Yes, there we go. Back to the Menti again. I hope it's visible. So we have 3 statements here, and we are interested if you are fully disagreeing, neutral, or fully agree, or something in between. So please go to the Menti again. It's the same code, so probably you're still logged in, I hope. And let's see if we can use this for a final discussion about the future of public transport. And I would also like to invite Maaike and Maria, of course, to react on one of these propositions. So far, there's hope for public transport, I see, based on your view. It's interesting, in the meantime, to share a quick brief anecdote. When I started our Smart Public Transport Lab, a lot of people told me, why are you actually going for public transport? Because it won't exist anymore in 2021. Now, I'm not sure if they were talking about ridership and COVID, but at least the industry is still there. And I think, but that's obvious from my perspective, I think it's in the end, it's about complementing things. And I think public transport can actually make a move, and they need to rethink anyway due to COVID. So I think they should embrace emerging modes more than currently they are doing. Maybe also Maaike, you can, or Maria, you can chip in on this first proposition. What do you think, Maaike?
Emerging modes will make public transport redundant. Well, I don't think so. I think some of the presentations showed that it can replace some public transport trips, but you will still need a very strong backbone of public transport. Very important to maintain or keep cities livable and also accessible, because they have much higher capacity than all the other emerging modes. So that
Yes.
would be my response, or my view at least. You may
Maria?
disagree, of course.
Yeah, I agree. I think public transport is still very much needed. And if I can add also to the second one, even if I consider that public transport is really needed and it's not going to be redundant with these modes, especially let's think in high dense area where we really need that mass transit that we see nowadays, but still those emerging modes can be added value. They can help fit. They can help be tailored to different needs, to different demand, which now is only being the car. And this range of modes allow for differentiation and variation, which is what we have in everything in life. So why not in transport and in public transport?
Thank you. About the second question, I was wondering if the audience, because in the beginning we voted for what's the most promising one, and I think it was shared bicycle. I'm trying to look it up, but it's not working here. I think it was the shared bicycle was first, then on demand was second, and autonomous shuttles were third. Maybe you could put in the chat if that's still, if your votes, first of all, if they are the same, and second of all, most importantly, have you changed your mind of the order you gave in the first place? Please give us some updates via the chat. And maybe also a question to you, Maaike, then with regard to the second one, emerging modes do offer substantial added value to cities. Do you think there is, in the usual list of emerging modes, micromobility, shuttles, etc., is there one you could, or maybe more, you think we should not go into that direction? Or you should, as a city, not go into direction? Or are they all having sufficient added value one way or the other? What do you think?
I think they can all have added value, but you have to look carefully at the position in the mobility system, because shuttles will not be successful at all locations. So there you have to look at the type of location and also the competing modes. So if people are cycling a lot there already, and there is already buses and trams and etc. available, then a shuttle will not be successful. So you have to search for locations where they can be. And I think the same goes, well, I think the same goes for all modes, but for shuttles that's actually most important, because the other modes are more flexible, I would say.
Yeah, maybe also a question to the audience. If there's any emerging modes you would like to mention here, which you think do not add value to your city or whatever, let us know. Also to you, Maria, I had a question about, also related, because we were talking about the Netherlands here quite often as our reference. I think it's safe to say that the Netherlands have a quite high level of public transport. Don't look at social media, but I think that's in general safe to say. What if the level of public transport is not so high, or actually there is not so much supply? Yeah? And what would you recommend then if people are thinking and discussing about on demand? Should you also recommend them to start conventional public transport, or is that a step to skip and go for the full flexible stuff?
I think the question is densities. How many densities are we? How much is the density there? Which is the size that we need? If we're going to have empty buses, then we'd better have something which is smaller and more flexible. But if we're going to have very high demand, which actually really needs the density that can only be offered with buses or with trams, with metros, then of course that is a step not to be missed. So depending on which is the demand, that would be the main aspect, and that's actually why I think in the whole of Europe we see that public transport is there, and now these modes of transport are trying to fill in the gaps. But for example, if we are talking about developing countries, where often you don't really see very much organized public transport. If the funds are available, of course, it would be a first step.
Okay, thank you. In the meantime, Klaus and Peter added some comments in the chat. Very much thanks for that. I think, Maaike, maybe you have you seen them? Could you reply to that about specification or distinction of types of users and also type of areas where shuttles might be helpful or not? Have you seen it?
Yes, I see the remarks.
What do you think?
There's one remark that says you need to segment the public transport market in terms of regions, like proximity to centers, times, etc. And one remark about target groups. And I agree, both are very important. I think in the study that I showed, where you see the impact on model split, there we did not look at shuttles, but at other emerging modes. Well, what I showed was the average over all types of regions combined, but underneath we distinguish between highly urbanized areas, less urbanized areas, up to rural areas and main ports. And then you see that the users is completely different, and also the function is completely different. Because in these rural areas there is less public transport, and the other options have a higher chance of or are more relevant. Whereas in city centers it's the other way around. And then when you would zoom into shuttles, it's a bit difficult to say. Because I think in city centers there are a lot of other options. So there can be, for instance, a high potential when you want to transfer people to specific event locations, for instance. Yeah, that's so you have to really zoom into specific locations where they have a high success rate. And also for the target groups or user groups, yeah, you see differences in willingness to share vehicles, and also differences in whether or not people can cycle. So yeah, I fully agree that you need to zoom into that.
Okay, thanks. And I would like to go to the final discussion. Klaus makes a very valuable comment, I think, and I would like to focus on the last part of his statement in the chat. PT needs to include innovations to maintain its position in the future, and then turn attention from options to users. And I think that's a nice one. Of course, they are related, but I think And that's also why I'm quite excited about the work Maria did and still is doing, because we tend to talk first about technology, also in the discussion with shuttles a couple of years ago, I think. Also with the mass discussions, mobility as a service, the user perspective actually is brought in quite recently, I could say. And given this user perspective, Maria, also related to the third proposition, the willingness to share is an important one, and you can see quite a wide variety here in this proposition, given the answers by the audience. I can see it as well. How would you see that, the willingness to share a vehicle or a ride? What is your opinion about our new lives after having this interesting year?
Well, I think it depends on whether we really can recover and go back to the old normal, or whether we will have to live with a new normal for a bit longer. But
what do you think?
I don't know too much about virus, so I'm not going to go in that domain. But in the statement that you make here, I think we all saw that when people were afraid of taking public transport, when public transport had to stop because most of the journeys were not being taken, when to be drastically reduced, these other modes had a very important role in filling all those gaps that would have otherwise been empty. And these other modes, like, for example, or the micromobility, really help people to move and not depend on their own vehicles. So I do think that COVID strengthened this need, this awareness for other modes. And last thing, I want to also, I agree fully with what Klaus says about we really need a range of modes. If we have hundreds of phones, hundreds of computers, hundreds of everything, why would we have just one type of public transport? We need all of them to fit all the needs of the users, which they are all different, and we need to fit them all, fit the needs of them all.
I like that as a very nice final remark. Thank you for that, Maria, and also thank you for Klaus triggering it. I see it's time, so I would like to thank, first of all, our speakers, Maria and Maaike, for your contributions, presentations, sharing your research with us. Would also like to thank you, the audience, for listening and also joining us in the discussion. And please join us later if you're interested. Connect to us in whatever way you like. We are all very happy to discuss with you later on to really make a difference and make the next steps. I wish you all a very good conference, and for those who like, I also wish you a very good football tournament starting tonight. Having said, have a good day. Thank you very much.